Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to the first of a brief series of reviews examining the classic RPG by Steve Jackson Games that has recently been reprinted and revived, The Fantasy Trip. While written by Steve Jackson, The Fantasy Trip was originally published as a series of minigames by Metagaming Concepts starting in the late 70s. In recent years, the property was reclaimed by Steve Jackson Games and cleaned up for republication. This time, I will be covering the modern version of the Fantasy Trip Melee, the first of the Fantasy Trip minigames. It is hardly a full RPG in and of itself, but is useful enough to use as a starting point for the system. Originally published back in 1977, the new version consists of a miniature box set containing the pamphlet-style rulebook, 3 6-sided dice, a hex map, a series of cardboard punch-out counters, all contained in a relatively small and easily carried full-color box. The dice are decent enough quality for what one would expect of such a product, with rounded edges and easily read pips. The map itself is a basic arena setup, just a group of mega hexes, short on details and mostly consisting of adjacent hexes grouped into groups of those 7 larger mega hexes. The Fantasy Trip, much like GURPS thereafter, uses a hex-based grid system for combat, although the concept of mega hexes is used to judge long-range things such as missile weapons and later spells. The counters are a nice mix, with a variety used for various characters and human fighters of various sorts, a few to represent the few animal and creature types that are present in the rules, and a number to represent various weapons and shields that can be dropped into the certain squares. Many of these are reversible to do double duty, with different weapon types on each side of the token, while monster and human tokens can be flipped to represent corpses, which do have a place in the rules. There are also a number of prone tokens that can be tossed onto the figure to represent it being prone. The rulebook itself is little more than a few stapled pages, just kind of a pamphlet here, just 24 pages long with no cover, single column text interspersed with occasional black and white artwork and tables. Very, very occasional black and white artwork and tables. The reason that it's only 24 pages is because it's not so much a general RPG as a set of tactical rules specifically for melee and to a lesser extent missile combat using only mundane weapons and attacks. The rules consist of just 10 sections overall. There's an introduction, a list of components, rules for creating a character or figure as they're called in this game, the turn sequence and combat options, movement rules, facing rules, attack rules, non-human figures, experience rules, and then an example of a combat run with the system. The introduction consists of a narrative example of a combat that is played out with the rules, then a quick introductory blurb that seems relatively quaint by modern standards. Components does just what I did before, list the components to expect within the box. The third section, creating a figure, is where the actual character creation rules start. The Fantasy Trip was apparently the first officially published system to use a point-by-creation system way back in the 70s, although to be truthful, there's not much to buy in the Melee game. Since there's no magic or other advanced rules in this, figures only really have 2 stats, strength and dexterity. Strength is needed to wear bulky armor and wield heavy weapons and serves as a measure of health, while dexterity is needed to determine initiative and determine whether hits occur. Characters get a certain number of points to distribute between the two, with each one starting at, I believe, 8. There's no money involved with character creation, rather a figure just picks a weapon and armor layout based within certain limits on what they can carry. Things like names and backgrounds are entirely optional but highly recommended. Section 4 covers turn sequence and options. Turns represent just a few seconds of time, and Melee introduces the Fantasy Trip's options system. Basically, instead of the modern idea of movement and actions, each character is actually limited to a menu of potential combat options that determines whether they can move and attack, and various combinations thereof. They're divided into different option groups, determined whether the character is engaged in melee or not, or engaged in hand-to-hand, barehanded fighting. Being engaged in melee limits the normal options, but may open up others. Fighters in hand-to-hand combat are even more limited. Characters determine initiative through a die roll and then simply select from options and then move on their turn. The movement section covers movement, and while relatively straightforward, movement represents the number of hexes that can be moved. It does offer options for being prone and kneeling, each of which have their own benefits and hindrances. Yes, there are benefits to sometimes being prone or kneeling, depending on whether you're taking fire or not. It is also here that corpses and prone bodies are discussed, since this ends up being the main point of difficult terrain in this particular version of the system. Yes, it's possible to have issues while trying to run across a field littered with the bodies of your foes. Facing rules follow, and changing facings can affect movement, what characters are considered engaged, and even whether they can block with their shield or attack with certain weapons. You can't, stab someone if they're behind your back. The attack rules are relatively simple. Aside from a few adjustments, one simply tests dexterity on 3 dice, and that determines whether you hit or not. Damage is reduced from a figure's strength until they perish. Inflicting a lot of damage can actually penalize a character's dexterity as well, and if you hit but are not hit in return, you can sometimes actually potentially drive your opponent backward. For such a simple system, there's a fair amount of complexity involved. There's even the potential to do extra damage on some rolls, or to drop or break your weapon on a particularly bad roll. Polearms, offhanded daggers, and shields all have their own specific options as well. Within the attack section is a weapons table, which shows how much damage a weapon does and how much strength is required to use it, along with any special rules that may be involved. There is also an armor section. Armor penalizes dexterity depending on type, caps your movement, and absorbs a certain number of hits from each attack. Armor in this game acts as damage reduction. Missile and thrown weapons have their own rules for range and facing, and there's the potential to hit your own allies in combat if you're not careful. The hand-to-hand rules can also turn a fight into a grapple that must be settled with either fists or daggers. After the completion of the combat rules, there's a list of non-human figures for when you engage them, mostly just a scattering of animals and a few monsters. One of the monsters, the giant, is an early example of the multi-hex creature. There are also some rules for creating fantasy fighters, such as elves and dwarves and such, which basically amounts to either changing the number of default point allotments, or adding a few extra abilities here or there, or some combination thereof. Experience rules are extremely simple, offering a certain number of experience for survivors of a combat, adjusted if the enemy was particularly hard, and offering the ability to increase strength or dexterity for set amounts of experience. More advanced leveling rules are presented in later products. The book then concludes with an in-depth example of a combat run with these rules. So the Fantasy Trip Melee is interesting in that it's not strictly a full RPG, but it does show the incipient elements of a more fully fledged one. It can certainly be used as an RPG with simply the idea of freeforming anything that's not combat, but is best simply used for combat resolution, and in fact can be stacked on other systems that have different resolution mechanics. That having been said, it does a fairly good job as an arena fighting system or combat resolution system on its own. For such a simple set of rules, it can provide for some pretty fairly in-depth tactical combats, and the fact that character creation is actually so quick means that a few minutes can have you facing teams of fighters off against one another for a few hours of fun. Mechanically, the game plays quickly enough, relying on just D6s for most tests. Indeed, those who have played GURPS will likely recognize the start of the dice system used in that game, as well as the stat system. Without all the overhead of a full RPG system with skills and the like, the rules-light group might actually find that it offers just the right amount of tactical complexity without stepping over the more narrative elements that they might use elsewhere. It's also interesting as a sort of historical curiosity. Although the Fantasy Trip is not directly related to Steve Jackson Games' later RPGs, the beginning aspects that a GURPS player might find familiar begin to prop up even in just the Melee version of this game. The Fantasy Trip Melee also directly interfaces with the Fantasy Trip Wizard, which is the magic-based minigame, and later in the Labyrinth, which is the full-on role-playing game version, both of which I will cover in future videos. In fact, I'll go into more in-depth of what I think about the Fantasy Trip as a system in the whole in the Labyrinth review. All in all, though, I do find it fun, although if you're looking to get into the Fantasy Trip, you might find it better to directly pick up in the Labyrinth. I will say that the box set has useful items such as tokens, dice, and a hex map, but if you have these sort of things already, then they may not have as much utility for you. I'm also moderately disappointed in the booklet quality. While I understand that a cover would have added to the production costs, even any sort of, cover at all would have made for better use at a tabletop. As it stands, it feels much like the sort of instruction booklet that you might find in any sort of consumer product that I personally would just discard or lose at some point. At any rate, I'll conclude it here. As always, links to where you can order Melee will be in the description below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.